Yo, what's up? I'm not going to waste any of your time, let's jump right into it. Basically what we're trying to do here is test Kafka with Sampo, then Kafka with Guinaifen. All their builds will be shown at the end so you have full context, but the idea here is to compare how they do against each other in as equal of a situation as possible. This MOC is pretty much as good as it gets since the elites on the first half are all fire and wind weak. Keep in mind though that we do have the turbulence buff in play, but it shouldn't be impactful on what we're actually trying to test. We've got our trusty DPS meter here as well, and let me tell you, it was a lot harder this time around since we actually have to track the dots and remove Asta's burns. Because of that, we're not tracking Xuan or Asta's damage, but it shouldn't matter too much since they make up less than 10% of the team's damage. As for how I actually went about doing the runs, I did at least a dozen attempts on each and took one of the median results in terms of cycle clears. I got some charts later to help us summarize the data, and then we'll be able to make some conclusions. One last note, I do certain things in these runs that help me save time or even a cycle, so I'll point them out as I go. For example, you might have seen me start with Asta's technique instead of Kafka's, and I had better results when doing this since I can start with max stacks on her talent. I can also just apply shock manually from Kafka's follow-up attack so we have shock right away. This also helps with skill point management since I won't need to use Asta's skill early on, and I don't need to use her ult in the first wave either, so the extra energy that would have been gained would be wasted. Speaking of energy, that's the other thing I tried optimizing in these runs, and in some cases I made sure the monkey would jump the character I wanted just to squeeze in an extra ult. Of course, I don't think my runs are perfect by any means, but they'll still be a good indicator for relative performance. Again, I picked one example run from each, so if you spot anything I could have done differently, do let me know in the comments since I try my best to read every one of them. Anyway, this run's going pretty well. Sampo does get stunned, but that's okay, we do get a big Kafka skill off. One problem I did notice with Sampo when starting a new wave, if you don't have your ult ready and there are multiple targets, it actually takes some time to ramp up all your wind shears. Once you do though, it's really easy to maintain wind shear and they hit so hard, like sometimes they're hitting harder than Kafka's dots. If you look at the DPS meter, the gap's actually pretty far, but it's gonna close as soon as Sampo applies all his dots. You saw him use his ult there, look at that, 17k wind shear. And now we're only about 60k per. Oh my goodness, I just remembered. One of the more annoying things about doing the DPS meter for Kafka is I have to do it every time she does her follow-up attack. Non-dot characters are way easier to do as well because I don't have to track damage on enemies' turns, but yeah, I don't mind doing. Oh my goodness, look at all those numbers. So satisfying. Yeah, I don't mind doing it. I like looking at the numbers, especially dots, because they're not as popular, I guess. It's hard to figure out how much damage is coming from where. But this one's a wrap. You can see that it falls to the wind shear and we have a 2-cycle clear. So that was the end of the Sampo run, and we can see here that between him and Kafka, they did just over 800,000 damage. Keep in mind that this doesn't account for overkill damage, but I'm pretty sure the difference is small enough that we can just ignore it. On to the Guinaifen run. Same thing, we're going to start with Asta's technique to get max stacks on her talent, and so we don't need to use her skill. I'm actually starting with Guinaifen's basic so that we can get Kafka's follow-up attack, and that way we not only get the burn, we also get the shock and fire kiss. I actually Xuan skill immediately, that way I don't need to use it next turn, and that way I can make either Kafka or Guinaifen get jumped by the monkey for extra energy. I guess a big disclaimer is Sampo's E6, whereas Guinaifen's E4. This is the best I could do. Like, I could go and pull more, but I already got 2 topaz from trying to get Guinaifen Eidolon, so that's not really an option. The results I got were pretty much what I was expecting, so we can actually use the Eidolon difference to answer certain questions as well. Also, if you want to replicate these teams, you don't need to use Xuan. You can use any soul sustain, and honestly, I'd prefer a skill point positive one anyway. Lucha would be the best, Bailu, Japard also work. But this should give us a good baseline, and the CC resist from time to time helps, as well as, you know, she pretty much makes it so that I can't lose. Here I actually use a skill just so that my Asta can break. Ideally though, I would have had Guinaifen break since she's got a lot of break effect from her traces and some from her relics as well. Doesn't really matter too much since the burn from break isn't very strong. We're still able to 1-cycle here, no problem, and on to the next wave. I was actually thinking about making this a DPS showdown, and I'll put it in the category anyway, but it's a little bit different than my traditional ones. It's not like a show match or anything, it's more informational. But let me know what you think of these types of videos and if you want to see more of them. I actually don't mind making them because they also satisfy my own curiosity. So the work that I put into it is actually for myself as well. Also, I know some of you are thinking about Luca, and I actually wanted to try to include him, but it's way too hard to make a fair comparison when there's no physical weak enemies. One day though, we'll definitely include him. Luca definitely needs some more spotlight. But yeah, this run's going pretty well. We're almost at the end of this one too. I think one of the big advantages that you can notice with Guinaifen is she doesn't really need to use her skill all the time. She can maintain her burn just by using her basic as well, or just using her skill once every 2 turns. She doesn't need to use her skill because it doesn't proc any of her dots, only her ult does. I guess you could also play Sampo that way, but you really want to get as much value out of his E4 as possible. His E4 procs dots if they have max wind shear stacks, so it's like a mini Kafka skill. Also, did you see how fast the dots shredded the Decaying Shadow's health bar? Oh my goodness. We get Asta to get jumped here. Perfect, because now she can ult. We've got plenty of turns left before the cycle ends, and this should be also a 2-cycle clear, matching Sampo and Kafka's run. If you've been paying attention to the DPS meter this time around, the split between Guinaifen and Kafka is way higher, but we can explain that later. We get the monkey to jump Kafka here, and that's just enough energy for her to ult as well. We still have a few more turns left, but this should be able to finish off the rest of the wave. And just like that, we got a 2-cycle clear using this team as well. So we've almost got a 60-40 split between Kafka and Guinaifen, and this makes sense and wouldn't change much even if she had her E6. Both her final Eidolons mostly improve her support ability rather than her personal damage, aside from the ult level increase, but it's not that impactful. We're going to take a look at the results side by side, but before that, I'd appreciate it a lot if you took a second to like the video and subscribe. These videos usually take a lot of time for manual entry, which means human error is possible, though I do double check everything. Also, don't worry, a lot of these numbers are just sums, so I didn't need to manually add everything. I'm not crazy. Anyway, both Sampo and Guinaifen took 2 cycles to clear, and in my attempts the vast majority of them were 2 cycles. 3 cycles happened a couple times where I got extremely unlucky with the Decaying Shadow stunning Kafka, but otherwise both teams cleared with the same relative comfort. Rotations felt really smooth, and skill point management wasn't an issue even with Xuan, though Luocha or another completely skill point positive sustain would have been preferred here. As far as personal damage goes, Sampo did do 23% more than Guinaifen, but this makes a lot of sense since he used 2 more skills. Guinaifen went skill point neutral, which is actually a good thing, but again, we want to use Sampo's skills thanks to his wind shear proccing ability being tied to his skill, thanks to his E4. His wind shear multipliers at max stacks is also much higher than Guinaifen's burns. Meanwhile, Guinaifen's burn proccing ability is locked behind her ult, which she's casting a lot less of than Sampo's skill, for example. Now, what I actually find interesting is they've kind of got reverse kits. Sampo applies a damage amplifying debuff on his ult, and Guinaifen applies it anytime burn does damage. This also works whenever Kafka procs it, or when Guinaifen procs it herself. The difference between the 2 debuffs is that Sampo's only impacts dot damage, whereas Guinaifen's applies to any source of damage. It's also much easier to maintain uptime on Guinaifen's thanks to it not being tied to an ultimate, and pretty much you'll have it 100% of the time. For Sampo, you'll see especially in fights like MOC 10, if you don't ult off the bat, the enemies don't get the debuff until way later on. But again, this is a trade-off because his skill can proc the dots, which can be more important, but Guinaifen as a debuffer works amazingly because she can just maintain 100% uptime on her vulnerability. Kafka did do 10% more damage in the Guinaifen team, even though they took pretty much the exact same amount of actions. If Guinaifen had her last 2 Eidolons, this difference would be even higher since it would increase the amount of vulnerability on the enemies. But overall, I'd conclude that their performances are pretty similar. They offer the same things, but their kits are different and they do it in different ways. I'd say for sure though that Sampo has more personal damage and Guinaifen is more reliable with her buff uptime, so she's better for buffing a team. And because her buff applies to any source of damage, she isn't just locked to dot teams, and also it does help Kafka's skill, follow-up attack damage, and her own skill damage as well. So if I had to pick one, it would be Guinaifen since she's got more buffing capability, especially if you slap on resolution shines. That being said, both are great, both work, just use whoever you want. But just before we get to the builds, enjoy this March ult. Both Guinaifen and Sampo have pretty similar stats. Guinaifen has a bit more break effect thanks to her traces and of course fire damage bonus. They're both using Good Night and Sleep Well at S5, and I made sure to level both the dot abilities to level 11. For Wind Shear, it's Sampo's talent. For Guinaifen, it's her skill for burn. Guinaifen's on 2-piece Firesmith, 2-piece Wild Weight, as well as 2-piece Space Sealing Station. She's at E4, unfortunately. I didn't get too lucky on the Topaz banner. I got well, I say that, but I got 2 Topazes, and I'm not going to pull for more just because I don't want to risk it. Sampo, also 142 speed, you'll see. He has more attack, but that's because he ascends with attack traces and he doesn't have wind traces. So at the cost of less damage bonus, he has more attack. And here you can see his talent is level 11. I didn't get his Ascension 6 trace because it's only defensive utility. It doesn't actually increase his output. 2-piece wind instead of the 2-piece fire, of course. And again, they're sharing the boots and I think they're sharing the rope. It's really hard to make them use the same relics when they're different scalars, but yeah. E6 Sampo makes his Wind Shear hit like an absolute truck, but it's not the end of the world that we're comparing an E6 versus E4. We know what to expect, we know what the differences are. And Xuan, of course, she's on our trusty old build. I actually have her on Broken Keel, which doesn't, I would prefer, of course, having Fleet of the Ageless, but for this run specifically, I didn't want to move around my relics. It takes so much time to move things around, and I had this build ready. I didn't want to swap around. So you can get more damage if you put her on Fleet. She is actually E0. I haven't activated this yet. And finally, Asta. Nothing crazy about her build. She's got Branya's Light Cone, 4-piece Hackerspace, 2-piece Fleet. You'll see everything right here. But anyway, I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you found something useful as well. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Also, let me know in the comments, as always, what you think of this style of video. It's kind of like a DPS showdown, but it's a little more informative, I think. But yeah, I enjoyed making it, and I will see you next time.